Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Fitton Center for Creative Arts. My name is Ian Mackenzie Thurley. I'm the Executive Director here at the Fitton. My great pleasure to welcome you here to the Fitton Center for our Celebrating Self series. We've had a wonderful series this year. We've got a few more to go, but wonderful as ever to see so many faces here, new and familiar, here at the Fitton Center. There's been a lot going on here lately. I'd like to first thank to Dave Sams for his guitar playing today. Thank you, Dave, before you escape for lunch. Dave is a native Hamiltonian, plays all around town, and is also on staff here at the Fitton Center. So if you or members of your family would like to take guitar lessons, you're able to do that through Dave. And also through Mike down the back here, Mike Hicks. We've got all our guitar players in the house, so we'll be having a little jam session after today. The theaters of Butler County. I personally, I have to say, have a great affinity for theaters and a great affection. When I traveled Europe the first time, most people around wanted to see the churches and the great architecture of these cities through Germany and the Czech Republic. For me, it was going to see theaters. I love them. That was my mecca. That's the doors I wanted to knock on and go through. And I was very, very fortunate to have seen many around the world and work through many in the world. And I know that from what I understand, and we'll find out more, that Hamilton too had many great theaters. And though those numbers have dwindled, we're trying to keep that alive here at the Fitton Center, and we feel responsible for that. And as you see, as this city is going under enormous change on a day-to-day basis, I feel, as do many, that we need to be able to reflect in our past and the great history of this city as an industrial town, as a city that always has punched well above its weight. And I'm keen to find out more of that. You can get yourself down to 2nd Street, which is the best street in all of Hamilton, I can tell you. Get yourself down to the Butler County Historical Society. They have lots of wonderful events going on throughout the year, not just the theaters, but to tell you a little bit about the history of Hamilton and, of course, Butler County, and the things that have been going on throughout history, because we don't want to lose sight of that, as we look forward, but we also need to be looking back. We can learn a great deal, and we can find out much, and we can incorporate that as we go forward. I'm really excited about the future of Hamilton, but I'm also very excited to be learning more about its past. So with that, I would like to bring to the stage the Executive Director of the Butler County Historical Society to talk about the theaters of Butler County, Ms. Kathy Creighton.
Well, I don't know how much you know about the theaters of Butler County, but at one time, Butler County was one of the top spots and stops on the vaudeville circuit. I mean, this was a going place. This is where people came, and all of the top vaudeville acts came to Butler County. Now, even though, let's see if I can mess this up. Okay, even though life was hard for the early settlers here in Butler County, of course, this is the 225th anniversary of the founding of Hamilton this year, with Fort Hamilton being founded in 1791. Even in the early days, the early 1800s, people were looking for entertainment, looking for diversions in their life. And some of the very first theatrical performances in Hamilton was performed by the Blanchard family. They had an old barn on Dayton Street, and they actually had a loft up there, and they would do theatrical presentations lit by lanterns or by candles. In 1822, several residents in Hamilton decided to found the Hamilton Thespian Society, and they brought in this gentleman here. His name is Edwin Forrest, to be one of the lead actors, and this man goes on to become one of the top actors in the United States in the early 1800s, and here he is getting his start, early part of his career right here in Hamilton. And it's interesting, you look at the names of the local people that founded this group in 1822, and you're going to recognize some of these last names. We had Charles Kilgore Smith, John M. Milliken, William B. Van Hook, Stephen Milliken, and Lorenzo Latham. So we know that the Milliken family has been committed to the arts here for over almost 200 years. But you go How many theaters were there in Hamilton? Well, we're going to go through a journey, and a lot of these you've probably never heard of. The very first one that they think was built was called Miami Hall. It opened around 1840. It was stood at the northeast corner of South 2nd and Court Street within the Miami building, and the third floor was an auditorium. And a lot of these buildings that I'm going to refer to in these theaters were called opera houses. And you go, okay, you picture the big, beautiful stage with the theater seating and everything. That wasn't an opera house. An opera house back in the 1800s was what we would probably consider an auditorium today. It was just a great big room that may or may not have a permanent stage at one end, but it was used as a multi-purpose facility for the city or for the town. And so they also would offer plays, they would have church socials there. You name it, they would do it in these opera houses. This is Rumple's Hall. It was built in the early 1840s, and it was at the northwest corner of Main and B Street. So both sides of the river developed its own theater district, its own theater history, both Rossville and Hamilton. And like I said earlier, Hamilton was considered one of the best show towns in the Midwest, and it was a favorite stop for the vaudeville entertainers in the early 1900s. Now, Beckett's Hall was located on High Street, and the building the block originally known as the Beckett block, and it was built in 1854. It was on the third floor of the Freckling Dry Goods store, and the auditorium was used for traveling and local stage productions, musical events, cotillions, dances, all things like this, political meetings and conventions. Jacobs Hall was located on the third floor of the Granville M. Flenner Building, 15 to 17 South 3rd Street, and it was the center of Hamilton's social activities. It was also used, like I said, these were multi-purposes rooms. When they didn't have a play going on in there, it was a roller rink. Of course, we all know the Dixon or Globe Opera House, located at 221 High Street, was built in 1866. Joseph Bender was the architect, and when it was an opera house, it could seat 1,200 people, and was one of the largest and finest in Ohio at the time that it was built. It primarily hosted vaudeville shows. It was a principal theater for vaudeville. It was sold to William C. Freckling, who then leased it to a series of operators. It was better known as the Globe Theater, even though it was originally built as the Dixon Opera House. By 1900, it was considered not adequate for the majority of the lavish vaudeville shows that were starting to come through. And by 1904, it was ordered closed by the city of Hamilton. Those of you that know the story, the theater people I know, of the Iroquois fire in Chicago, when people were not able to get out of the theater because there was no fire escapes or doors, that was when the US government comes through and said, we now have to have set standards for theaters, and the Dixon or Globe Opera House did not have the adequate fire escapes, and that's when it quit being a theater. Of course, more of you know it as the Robinson Schwen building, because Robinson Schwen was in there for so many years, and of course now it's the home of downtown Hamilton. Music Hall was built by the United German Society of Hamilton to compete with the Globe or the Dixon Opera House. It was at 457 South 2nd Street, opened on September 2nd, 1882, by the United German Society. It was better known as Music Hall, and it was the scene for the fashionable parties, dances, and holiday balls. Unfortunately, it was not near as popular as the Globe Theater was. It had a hard time making it, and for a short time in 1894, it actually was converted to an armory for the National Guard unit, and so it didn't have a very happy history behind it. Of course, many of you recognize it probably as the Second Ward School. It was converted into the Second War School, renamed, it was the Harrison School from 1909 until 1952, and the building was torn down in 1999. Now, the Grand Theater was built by John E. McCarthy, who was a local boy. He went to school at Jones Station or Stockton. I don't know, many of you know where Stockton is. My husband's family, his mother's side is from Stockton. It's the very corner of southeast Butler County, right by where Mulhauser Road comes over. That's the Stockton area. That's where he was from. And he opened the Grand Theater in 1905. It was a 400-seat vaudeville theater, and they only had it open a couple of years, and they outgrew the facility. So they immediately opened another theater called the State Theater, and kept building and building and building. And when they opened, the general admission prices were 10 cents, 15 cents, and 20 cents, depending on where your theater seats were. Now, like I said, McCarthy was a local boy, and he's kind of interesting. And I'm going to talk about people from Butler County as we go through that made it big. And I'm sure none of you have ever heard of him. But he and his wife were very active with the Irwin Brothers' big circus. Toured on the vaudeville scene for over 15 years till he comes to Hamilton and opens his theaters. And while he's managing the theaters here in Hamilton, he is actually serving as the president of the National Vaudeville Association. So in his day, he was very, very important figure in the vaudeville circus, or the vaudeville circuit. The Lyric Theater was on 321 High Street, and it was continued also to be a vaudeville theater. A lot of these theaters, we just know they existed. We don't know a lot about them. The Jewel Theater was located at the southeast corner of South 2nd and Court. When it opened, it had seating for 350 people. What's interesting about this one, it was designed by a man by the name of John Eberson. He was a very well-known playhouse architect, and he was better known as Opera House John because he went throughout the entire country building opera houses. The one here in Hamilton happened to be one of the first ones that he did in his career. And of course, this one was torn down in the 1960s, and you just might want to notice the picture to the right. Of course, it was right on High Street. That's the 1913 flood. You can see the water levels halfway up the first floor of the building. This one, some of you may remember, the Rialto, or the Court Theater, was at 50 High Street, opened in 1920 as an 867-seat movie theater. In 1927, they presented the first talking picture here in Butler County. It was a movie called Broadway Melody. And this theater also had what they called the Mighty Wurlitzer. Those of you that remember, I remember my parents talking about it. The Wurlitzer grand organ was what played in the background at so many of these theaters, and they were noted for their Wurlitzer theaters. This theater changed names, went to the court in 1959, closes in 1988, reopens in 1989, back under the name of the Rialto Theater. It has since been torn down, and the Rialto Theater stood where Lentil Park is today. We have the Smith Theater, which then becomes the Jefferson Theater, opened in 1903 to present traveling stage shows, had seating for 1,600 people. Now you think, all these theaters so far are all open at the same time. You know, you've got seating, I haven't added this up, but I would bet you have seating for at least 6,000 or 7,000 people that can go to the theater in Hamilton at the same time. And like I said, this was a happening place. Their first production when the theater opened was a comic opera called Emerald Isle. They had an audience of 1,800. Now remember I said the theater only seats 1,600. They had 1,800 people, 200 standing. And now this is in 1903, and these people paid $10 a ticket to get in to see this. So this was quite the feat here for Hamilton. Interesting, this theater was designed by local architect Frederick Mueller. It had a 67-foot stage, and it was meant for plays and for holding musicals. And of course, it was destroyed by fire in 1928, so this theater wasn't around very long. Palace Theater, some of you should recognize this building. This is one of the few theaters that are still standing here in Hamilton today. It's located at 213, 219 South 3rd, and it was the first theater built in Hamilton exclusively for movies. Opened in 1920 and cost $100,000. Again, it was designed by Frederick G. Mueller here in Hamilton, and it was designed for the theater managers of Harry Turberg and Harry Silver, who came to Hamilton in 1919. The theater closed in the late 1950s, and today it's the home, the practice area for the Hamilton Civic Theater. They took it over in 2004. Now, Harry Turberg, I've actually had people when I've done this talk that said they remembered Harry. To me, this man was a genius when I started learning about the theaters of Butler County. He came to the United States in 1872. He was born in Lithuania, settled in Chicago, meets his wife. They moved to Hamilton along with his brother-in-law, who was Harry Silver, and they opened the theater, start with opening the Palace Theater, and then they also had the Paramount Theater later here in Hamilton. But what this guy was a PR genius. When we started looking at this, his granddaughter still lives up in the Columbus area, and she brought us her dad's scrapbooks, or her grandfather's scrapbooks. This man, if there was a way to work an angle for a show, he did. If they were having an Esther Williams movie with the bathing beauties, he'd have 20 girls in bathing suits standing in front of the theater. He would give all of the newspaper boys free tickets to get into the theater. If they had a show like about miners or something, he'd take an old man dressed up like a miner leading a pack mule down Hamilton. This man was a genius, and there was in the scrapbooks many, many congratulatory thank you notes from the big movie houses in Hollywood for the publicity stunts that he came up with. He passes away here in Hamilton in 1944, and he was known as Big Daddy to the people that knew him. Another interesting, and like I said, that in the silent times you had to have people playing the piano or playing the organ, and I came across this picture of Olivia Krahn Irwin, and she played for many, many years at the Jefferson, the Lyric, and the Palace theaters here in the 1920s. And many of you may know her son, Jim Irwin. This is his mother. Of course, the Paramount Theater was considered Hamilton's most elegant theater, and of all of the ones, this is the one I wish I could have seen the inside of before it was tore down. Everyone says this place was absolutely spectacular. It was designed by George Rapp and C.W. Rapp, theater architects from New York City. Closed around 1960, and if you say, well, where is this? There's this very little teeny alley that has this nice mural that was painted on the wall about 3 years ago. That was the entrance to the theater. That's where it was. And it was a narrow entranceway, and then it opened up to the parking lot behind the bank. That's where the theater was. Now, the Eagle Theater, we don't know a lot about, but it was located on the northwest corner of Court and Journal Square. We have the Princess Theater, which was longer called the Gem Theater, opened in 1907, had seating for about 200 patrons. And what's interesting about this theater was that at the time of the Iroquois Theater, and when they went through and closed all the theaters, this is the only one in Hamilton that met the new specifications for emergency exits and fire escapes and everything else. And when it opened in 1910, tickets were 5 cents a piece. Of course, those of you from Lindenwold, the Linden Theater, it's still standing. It's an empty building right now, but it opened in 1940. It's had several different names throughout the time period, but it originally opened, it had seating for 400 people. And I'm just going to throw in a couple of fast ones here. Of course, the Rossville Theater opened in 1946, had seating for just under 600 people, closed in 1966, converted into a church, then reopened as the Cinema West Theater in 1970, closed again in 1994. But it's interesting, when it opened in 1946, weekday matinees for children were 10 cents and adults were 30 cents. And then we had the Royal Theater, which is located at 35 Main Street between B and High Street. I'm thinking that it probably was the third floor of the building where Riverbank is. And I'm thinking that it's probably the third area. I've also heard that they thought it was destroyed during the 1913 flood, but this building was there in the 1913 flood and it withstood the flood. So I'm thinking this must be the building where the theater was located. So now you wonder, well, how many theaters have we gone through in Hamilton? 20 plus theaters. And of course, I did not include anything of the modern ones, the multi-screens and things like that. Nor, let's see, whoops, I actually missed the Bijou, I missed one. This was also known as the Buckingham Theater, 323, 325 Court Street. Was only in operation about 13 years, and it was primarily, again, a vaudeville theater. So now we get the ones that I usually get people telling me stories about. The Acme Drive-in. I think you probably all know it was at 6130 Dixie Highway in Fairfield, and it had room for 300 cars. Now, I will tell you, I've done this talk numerous times at retirement centers. I usually don't get the stories about this one until I get down to a couple of the others, but I've heard some pretty good stories of what's happened at these drive-ins throughout the years. Of course, the Holiday Auto is the only one that is still in operation in Butler County. I got a kick, those of you that are into Star Wars, the opening night for the new Star Wars movie, it wasn't in January. I'm listening to WLW driving into town, and they're saying, well, if you want to see pictures or go to see it on opening night, there's only one place left in the entire tri-state that hasn't sold out, and that's the drive-in theater in Hamilton. So they still run first-run movies at the Holiday Auto Drive. Of course, the Ramona on Dixie Highway. It's a shame we have not been able to find pictures of so many of the drive-ins. I guess it's because they weren't built to be pretty buildings, and so nobody bothered to take pictures of them. The Colonial Riverview is the one I usually get. This one, and I get a lot of stories about. I've been told this was mosquito heaven, and that nobody bothered to watch the movies there. So anyway, that one was here in the area. And then the last one, the Valley Drive-in, the screen is still standing, but the theater is no longer open, and it was at 2380 Hamilton Eaton Road. When it opened, it had room for 11,150 cars. I know, I heard the what in the back room? Yeah, that's a lot of cars. Moving on to Middletown. The Bijou Opera House was in the Oddfellows building in 1891, and then they had the Bijou Theater, which was in the west wing of the Bundy building. It was a 100-seat theater, and it closed in 1924. Of course, the Sorg Opera House. You all know the Sorg Opera House, located on Main Street, was built in 1890 by Paul J. Sorg, the owner of Sorg Tobacco Company, who was one of the richest industrialists in Butler County at the time that the Opera House was built. This was designed by Samuel Hannafort, an architect from Cincinnati, who also designed Cincinnati's Music Hall and Cincinnati City Hall. Like I said, Hannafort was the architect for this one. Sorg gave this theater to the people of Butler County as a present. And when the auditorium was built, it had a main floor with 2 balconies, seating for more than 1,000 people, and it was illuminated by more than 1,200 electric light bulbs. Vaudeville was the main attraction, and if you went there and if you were on the main floor, the first balcony, gentlemen, you were required to wear a tuxedo. If you were wearing a suit, you had to go to the second balcony. This was a very classy place. They had a fire in 1925 that damaged the backstage area. They remodeled the theater and it became the Colonial Theater, and they are in the process right now of trying to restore the Sorg Opera House. I'm not sure how far along they are, but I know they are working on trying to restore this building. We had the Eagle Theater, which was also known as the Majestic, and the State Theater. Had 3 different names. It was on 1226 Central Avenue. And it was basically known for featuring westerns and comedies. The Broadway Theater opened in 1903 by William E. Gordon. Now, Gordon was a theater person to reckon with in Middletown. He first has the Broadway Theater, but he rapidly outgrows this, and he closes it in 1909, and he opens the Airdome Theater. This had seating for 1,000 people, and it was located on the southeast corner of 2nd Street, which is now Manchester Avenue and the Miami-Erie Canal. Now, it burns down in 1915 with only the walls remaining. So that doesn't stop him. So in 1913, they opened the Gordon Theater. But what's interesting about the Gordon Theater is it opens in 1913. Frank Gordon passes away, and his wife, Mamie, goes on to assume the leadership of his theaters in Middletown, which, if you think about it, in 1913, it's unheard of for a woman to, first of all, be in business, and second of all, a respectable woman to be in the theater business. But she continues to run the theaters right there in Middletown. We had the Dreamland Theater, also known as the Gem. It was only a 150-seat theater, opened in 1909 or 1907. It didn't have a stage for plays, and it only showed movies. The Strand, or the Studio Theater, opened in 1922. It was also noted for having the mighty Wurlitzer pipe organ. The original building was torn down and replaced with the new Strand Theater in 1929, which closed in 1959, and the building was demolished in 2010. Now, again, if I had to pick a theater in its heyday that I'd want to see in Middletown, it would either be the Sorg or it would be the Paramount. This was the sister theater to the Paramount here in Hamilton. It opened in 1931, and it was closed in 1963, and the city parking lot now stands where this building stood in Middletown. And again, to our theater people, Harry Ziegler was the organist at the Paramount and the Strand theaters for many, 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 many years in Middletown. And there he is sitting at the mighty Wurlitzer. We also had the Rex Columbia Family Theater, opened in 1915 on Central Avenue, and it closed in 1930. Other theaters in Middletown, we had the Princess Theater, we had the Lorenzo Theater, the Grand Theater, and that makes 14 plus theaters in Middletown. So, I mean, you didn't have to, if you didn't want to come to Hamilton, you went to Middletown, you could have just about as much fun. The Town East Cinemas was in front of the Starglow Drive-in. It was a multi-screen theater owned by Earl Cox, built, and he opened, his opening movies were Superman and Any Which Way We're Loose, But Loose, when he opened this. We're going to talk about Mr. Cox here in a minute. But he gets into the theater business in Middletown by building the Starglow Drive-in. It was a single theater that had room for 428 cars and opened in 1955. Now, Mr. Cox gets his idea for opening a drive-in. They had drive-ins open. They were just starting to open prior to World War II. But Mr. Cox was in the Navy during World War II. And he remembers getting off the boat on some deserted island or so, they thought, in the Pacific, and stringing up a screen between a couple of trees, and all the natives coming out to watch the movies. And so he thought, well, if it's good enough for the natives, I'll bet people will pay money if they can drive and sit in their car. So this is how he gets into the theater business in Middletown. Of course, there's several other drive-ins in the area. You have the Dixie Cruise-In that was an Excello. It had room for 300 cars. So if you wanted to go to the drive-ins, you didn't have to go far in Butler County. So let's just take a look at some of the outlying towns. We looked at, the two biggest towns that were in Hamilton to begin with. But Miltonville, they had the Eagle Tavern, or the Eagle Inn, was built in 1816. The main floor was a restaurant, the second floor was lodging, and the third floor was an opera house. They had benches and armrests sit in there. They had curtains were made of coarse material, and they had traveling troupes that would stop, but primarily it was used for local theater productions. And due to the hard wear on the floor, they had to declare the room unsafe for people and close the theater down. 7 Mile had an opera house. And if you look, you're going, if you know anything about 7 Mile, that building might look familiar to it. It's still standing today as an apartment building. It's at 204 Ritter Street. Again, it was primarily used for local talent. They did have a few traveling shows come through, but primarily a local theater. In Mason, they had the Dodds Opera House, which was built in 1881, and they were bringing in middle line, lower level vaudeville type circuit they were on. Now the building burns down in 1886. So in 1887, a man by the name of Samuel Sprinkle builds the Sprinkle Opera House on the site of the Dodds Opera House. And you can see this building is still standing, but the Opera House was upstairs, and they had the outside entrances going up there. They had 5 chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling, but there never was permanent seating. Like I said, opera houses had some different uses for it. This building is currently, I believe, a Fifth Third Bank. And I have been told that if you go upstairs where the old opera house was, they used to hold basketball tournaments in there, along with performances. You can still see the stripes on the floor for the basketball court. And back in the theater area, the local talent used to write their names on the walls. And I've been told that's all back there, but so far I haven't been able to talk my way into the bank to find out if it's true. Now you go, when I talked about major cities, what about Oxford? Well, Oxford, of course, had what was going on the campus, but they've only ever had 2 theaters in Oxford, which I think is very strange. The Miami Theater was built, the original building for the theaters was built in 1893, closes in 1989, was also called the Western Theater. And then, of course, you have the Talawanda or Princess. And it's interesting, the first time I did this talk, I was talking to some people, and there were some people from Oxford in the audience, and I said, this is currently closed due to a fire. And they told me I was crazy. And I said, have you driven by there lately? But unfortunately, in December of last year, they tore the entire building down. They were supposed to have saved the facade. As far as I know, nothing was end up was saved of the building. They're supposed to be building a theater on the same property, a movie theater, but I don't know for certain. Bunker Hill. Anybody know where Bunker Hill is? I have a few people shaking their heads. Well, this is actually the Universalist Church in Bunker Hill, and they, besides being a church, they would hold local entertainments there. And that we know on December 6th, 1902, the first motion picture to be seen in the western part of Butler County was shown at the church. It was a film that was less than 30 minutes long, and it had scenes from a passion play, a fire company fighting a fire, and a group of dogs playing. Now, don't you think that would be real entertaining, especially to the young crowd today? But that was the first moving picture in the western part of Butler County. Riley. How many of you know Riley had an opera house? Was converted into the volunteer fire department. The building is no longer standing. But Riley had something special going. They had a lady by the name of Delora Beatrice Duncan Marmaduke. And if any of you have ever gone to Riley They hold this lady in such esteem. She is up on a pedestal like you wouldn't believe, because even though she started out with a professional career, she went to Miami University. She was from Raleigh, went to Miami University, went to the Chicago Conservatory of Music to study, was in the chorus for the Chicago Symphony for a while, but she comes home to Raleigh and she does the local productions for the school and the school children. And anyone who went to the Raleigh schools knew this lady and loved her dearly. I do know that I've talked to several of the people that have since passed, and they said she was quite a character. And the one told me in her later life, she was living in one of the retirement centers in Oxford. She always dyed her hair red. And he said no one had the heart to tell her that she missed the huge portion of the back of her hair. But she's definitely held in high regard in Raleigh. Shandon, the Congregational Church, was the site of many, again, local presentations, and they brought down a lot of the entertainment. The college students from Oxford would come down and perform at the Shandon Congregational Church. Now, if you're from Trenton, you know, never have had a theater, never had an opera house, nothing. The closest they came was in the late 1940s during the summer. They would put up a temporary screen in one of the parks and hold outdoor movies for families. And that's the closest they ever came to having a theater. But, you know, we talk about some of the people from Butler County that made it big. Now, some of these names you're not going to know, and some of them you're going to know. But this is Lou Beauchamp. He passes away in 1920, but he was known as the humorous philosopher. He was very big on the Chautauqua Lecture Series, and I'm going to put in a shameless plug right now. I think it's the 14th through the 18th of June. The Ohio Humanities Chautauqua will be here in Hamilton at Miami Hamilton. Save those dates. For 5 nights, there will be first-person presentations under the big top at Miami Hamilton, and there will be workshops during the day for various groups. And he was part of this Chautauqua Talk. Started out, apparently, according to his wife, as an alcoholic, saw the light, was reformed, and he gave inspirational speeches, and his best-known speech was called Take the Sunny Side. He gave this talk more than 1,000 times throughout the United States. An interesting group we found was the Brooklyn Comedy Four. These were made up of gentlemen from Raleigh and from Hamilton. They were a comedy group, also a musical group. The gentlemen were Perry Stomps, Elma Raines, Adam Goldrick, and Ben Thompson. And you say, well, how big were they? They actually toured in every major U.S. city. They went to Honolulu, New Zealand, India, South Africa, Ireland, and the United Kingdom between 1909 and 1925. So they were pretty big. Of course, Stella Weiler Taylor. More of you know her as the author of Rosemary. She came from a theatrical family. She lived at the Straub House here in Hamilton, which was the hotel that most of the vaudeville players stayed at. She was an amateur thespian herself, but she was better known for doing reviews in her column, which of course was called Rosemary. That's for remembrance, and it was called A Series of Lavender-Scented Memories of Other Days in Hamilton. She actually produced and directed a lot of the local presentations here in Hamilton, and again, an amateur, but one that's very well loved here in Hamilton. Another interesting person I found was Frank Simon. He is from Middletown, and you're going, okay, I haven't heard of him, but at the age of 9, he started playing the flute, picked it up, took no lessons, played by ear, was doing all of his fingering wrong, and he said to his mom finally, he said, if you'd buy me a cornet at the age of 14, I'll study and make something of myself. Well, he did. He became the director of the Middletown Band, and by 1914, he's the lead cornetist for the John Philip Sousa Band. He is given an honorary doctorate from Capital College of Oratory and Music. He founded the band department at Cincinnati Conservancy of Music, and in 1940 he comes back to Middletown and becomes the director of the Armco Band, which had its own radio show on NBC. And he directed it for many, 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 many years, and he is now in the American Bandmasters Association Hall of Fame. Now, David Howard Lindley, I think very dashing looking character, 1905 graduate of Hamilton High School, begins his professional theatrical career by joining the Forepaugh Stock Company, a Cincinnati-based theatrical outgrowth of the Adam Forepaugh and Sells Brothers Circus. He spends a lot of time doing some plays, a little bit of things, then hits the 1913 flood. He comes back to Hamilton. His father was in the real estate business. He comes back here to help his father try to get his business back on track. And in 1916, he returns to New York and makes it big on Broadway. He was in a play called Just a Woman that ran for 136 performances on Broadway. He was a well-respected member of the Actors Equality Association. And in the early 1930s, he becomes the radio director and voice coach for NBC Corporation in Chicago. Pearlie Poor Sheehan, his whole family were involved in either writing or into the theater. He actually was working for the Associated Press in Paris and during the 1913 flood. And he comes back and he starts writing, I think this is probably Richard O's mentor down here, detective stories and writing for like True Detective, Thrilling Detective, things like this. Well, he's asked to go to Hollywood, and they turn a lot of his early dramas or his detective stories, and he writes the films, the screenplay for his various articles that he's written. Of course, Fanny Hurst, when I first put this together, I had never heard of Fanny Hurst. Now we're working on a historical marker for her here in Hamilton. She was born here in Hamilton, but it's kind of a strange story because her parents were living in St. Louis. Her mother was born here in Hamilton. Her grandparents and her great-grandparents were still here in Hamilton. And her mother wanted to have her firstborn in the house where she had been born. So she comes here from St. Louis just to give birth to her daughter, Fanny. Fanny basically grows up in St. Louis, but spends her summers here, and she calls Hamilton her summer place because she'd spend all of her summers with her grandparents. Those of you that know anything about Fanny, she was definitely a lady way before her time. At one point, she was the highest paid journalist in the United States, writing in the 1930s on very provocative issues such as race relations, gay rights, women's rights, and a very, very productive person. We've been featuring her right now at the Butler County Historical Society. We just ran one of her movies last Saturday. We're going to be probably running another one in May. We had a few technical problems we have to get worked out before we run the movies again. But a very interesting woman, like I said, very far much before her time, but very much forgotten today. Harry C. Hoffman is another interesting character. He was born in Illinois and grew up in Kansas, but his family is from Oxford, and in later life he comes back to Oxford, and he's actually buried in the Riley Cemetery. But what makes it interesting is where he grows up in Kansas City, and his next door neighbor is a man by the name of Tom Howard. If any of you know your stories of your outlaws, Tom Howard is the name that Jesse James takes after he drops out of the crime business. He grows up next door to Jesse James, and when Jesse James dies, his father is one of the pallbearers for Jesse James. He grows up with Jesse James Jr. as his best friend, and when Hollywood decides to make stories of Jesse James Jr. plays his father, and Harry Hoffman plays, just lost it, Frank, is it Frank? Yeah. What's the last name? No, not Frank James. It's who's in the James gang that's got a different last name? Oh, anyway, that's who he plays in the movies. So anyway, this is Jesse James Jr. and Harry Hoffman here. When Harry Hoffman came back to Oxford, he donated all of his movie paraphernalia to the Historical Society. And so we have the original pictures on this stuff. Now this guy, if you had to look at him, would you think he was a villain? This is Robert C. Schnabel, born in Hamilton in 1873, and was very active in the time of the silent movies. He always played the heavy hitter or the villain. He played with such people as Ethel Barrymore, Nazimova, Barbara Stanwyck, Gloria Swanson, Frederick March. Very, very popular in the silent movies, but when talkies comes out, he drops out of the business. So I'm assuming he must have had a terrible voice. But very big in the silent movies. Edwin Martindale sang in several Hamilton choirs. He doesn't pass away until 1955. Was a soloist at the United Presbyterian Church in Hamilton. Begins his career in New York, where he had roles in 16 Broadway productions. And over the next 30 years, he acted in 92 films for Hollywood, in such movies as The Scarlet Woman, The Phantom of the Opera, Lady Windermere's Fan, In Old Kentucky, The Desert Song. Had a very big, long career in Hollywood. Now this one, a lot of you probably knew, Dean Miller, born in Hamilton in 1924, passes away in 2004. He was born Dean C. Stuhlmuller. He was an actor and a broadcaster and best known for his role as the son-in-law, Matt Henshaw in December Bride. I'm sorry, I'm old enough, I remember that show. He made his screen debut in a movie called Skirts Ahoy, which was a musical comedy starring Ethel Williams, Vivian Blaine, Joan Evans, and Barry Sullivan. After his film career, he goes on to host a show called Here's Hollywood, which is kind of like the various talk shows that they have now on about Hollywood and the stars and everything else. And he interviewed such people as Elizabeth Taylor, Cary Grant, and Paul Newman. And during the late 1960s, early 70s, he was the news anchorman for television stations in Washington, D.C., Miami, and Detroit. Now, this is an interesting story. The first time I did this talk, I did not have Agnes Moorehead in the talk. And everyone said to me, they came up to me and said, "Where's Agnes Moorehead?" How many in the room, besides Nancy Fulmer, who cannot raise her hand, knew that that Agnes Moorehead spent time here in Hamilton? We have a few. Her father was the minister at First Presbyterian here in Hamilton from 1904 to 1912. And so she was born in 1900, so she started her school years here in Hamilton. It's an interesting story because the Moorehead family, they're buried in Dayton. So there always has been a connection to Ohio, even though if you go online and look up her official Hollywood resume, she does not mention Hamilton at all. It's all about St. Louis, growing up in St. Louis. But she did start her school years here, and she did live in Hamilton for 8 years, her formative years. Of course, her film debut was an Orson Welles production of Citizen Kane, but most of us probably remember her from Bewitched, which probably is her best known role. And of course, where could we talk about theater people from Butler County without the McGuire Sisters? It surprises me today, I guess I'm showing my age, is how many people don't know who the McGuire Sisters were or are. Two of them are still alive. Of course, in the early 30s, they were growing up in Middletown and Miamisburg. By 1949, they are touring military bases, veterans hospitals, until they land a contract with Arthur Godfrey, who gave them a 7-year contract, and that's what launched them to stardom. They had over 60 singles that they recorded, including 35 that made the top charts. They had 6 gold records. They performed for 5 presidents and Queen Elizabeth II. and they've been inducted into 5 different halls of fame. Now, they retired from performing in 1968, and the reason they think that they retired, it's never been confirmed, was that they were being blacklisted. Those of you that know the story of Phyllis McGuire, they said she was having an affair with Sam Giancana, the mafia boss. She swears up and down it was platonic. There was nothing to it. But the group is blacklisted in Hollywood for quite some time. They do reunite in 1986 and go on a tour to various theaters throughout the United States and Canada. But in 1912, Dorothy McGuire dies, and she's the only one of the sisters, as far as I know, that's passed. The other 2, as of at least 3 weeks ago, were still alive. And then the last person, Ray Combs. I've had several people say, I taught him in class. He was from Hamilton's Garfield High School, graduate in 1974. He was a warm-up performer for studio audiences for such shows as The Golden Girls, Facts of Life, and The Tonight Show, but he's best known as being the MC of The Family Feud. Unfortunately, he suffers an automobile accident from which he never recovers totally, and threatens suicide several times and eventually does commit suicide. And that's the end of his career. So that's just a kind of a fast look at all the theaters here. Thank you for being a great audience.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I delight no more than hearing about immigrants coming to Hamilton and running successful theaters. That's a conversation I'm happy to hear all day, every day. I also have to add that my directorial debut in the United States was at the Sorg Theater up in Middletown. So a good 15 years ago, beautiful space. I have to say it had the best button I've ever seen in any theater on the side of the electrical equipment. It had a panic button that you could press, it would turn red. I don't know if it did anything else, but I've always wanted one. It would be remiss of me not to thank TV Hamilton. We have Steve Caldwell here from TV Hamilton and their partners. They record all of our Celebrating Self series, so you'll be able to get that if you have cable with TV Hamilton, also online with their YouTube channel to do that. So please get on and you can share that with your friends and other Celebrating Selves if you've missed them. We really appreciate the support from TV Hamilton and throughout the community. We look forward to seeing you at the Fitton Center again very soon. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.